Hi, I'm Daniel Lucas,
And this is Mick, the Doctor of Nature.
and welcome to Sex 101. Sex 101 is created to empower, of course, sex and relationship. And last week we have a great episode, Mr. Mick. But today we have better, best, excellent topic. And what would it be, Mr. Mick?
Sure, this is the shocking truth about the world's oldest profession. So, if I'm going to introduce this subject, let me say something about it. The world's oldest profession is a topic of ongoing debate and research among historians and scholars. I'll refer to what scholars have said, a bit of history, and we'll also have the opportunity to hear from working prostitutes. The thesis of the piece is that with the modern imitation of ancient prostitution and the proliferation of sex, actually fewer children are being born than ever before. There's something like a mismatch here. In fact, according to the data released last year by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the US birth rate had hit a new low after declining for the last 17 years. Prostitution's historical significance is highlighted in the work, and which is really standard, of Vern and Bonnie Bullough, who explore its evolution and the various forms it has taken over the centuries. They argue that understanding prostitution requires a foundational comprehension of women's roles in society, as the profession often reflects broader cultural dilemmas such as women's status as property, sexuality, and social class dynamics. Their book, Women in Prostitution, is a panorama of the forms and practices prostitution has assumed in many cultures over many centuries. Based on the assumption that one cannot understand prostitution with first not understanding the role of women in society, this volume is a comprehensive treatment of the historical, sociological, and anthropological background of prostitution. The authors expose the inextricable interweaving of scores of cultural dilemmas: women as property, pornography and the fear of sexuality, religion and promiscuity, sex and social class, and the control of venereal disease. The book conveys the tragedy and humor, the fortitude and cunning, the veniality and generosity, the real and counterfeit sensuality, and the hypocrisy and pathos that surround the lives of prostitutes. The beautiful, the powerful, the talented, and the most outrageous are here: Tamar, Pompadour, Dubarry, Emma Hamilton, Lola Montez, and Calamity Jane. But in addition to the tales of the illustrious, these pages are filled with the experiences of the anonymous and the abused. The book presents a panorama of prostitution's practices globally, illustrating the complex interplay between culture and the profession, discusses not only the lives of well known figures in the field, but also the experience of others, individuals, shedding light on the social, cultural implications of prostitution. It's a book that provides this comprehensive overview, not only explores the known, but also the unknown. And one of the book's explorations is the pervasive stigma associated with sex work. It examines how this stigma has been perpetuated throughout history, often rooted in social attitudes towards female sexuality and the perceived moral transgressions of those engaged in the profession. The book delves into the varying perceptions of sexuality across cultures and time periods, highlighting how societal norms have shaped the public understanding and treatment of sex workers. And with all of these experiences, it presents a worldwide global view, and it actually is that standard view of prostitution commonly held by pundits, and will examine its premises. In conclusion, a book like this serves as a valuable resource for scholars, policymakers, and advocates seeking to understand the nuances of this complex and often misunderstood industry.
Misunderstood. So, what is the gender dynamics of prostitution?
So, further exploration reveals that prostitution is not merely a profession, but also has a reflection of gender dynamics within society. The predominance of women in this field has historically shaped its characteristics and influenced public perceptions. Social norms have dictated women's roles, often relegating them to the margins of professional life, particularly in context as social work has been described as a female professional project. The gendered nature of prostitution is deeply rooted in the structures that have long dominated many societies. So women facing limited economic opportunities have often turned to sex work as a means of survival, particularly in the face of poverty, lack of education, and limited access to other forms of employment. This vulnerability has been exploited by those who seek to profit from the sex trade, creating a cycle of exploitation that is difficult to break. Moreover, the stigma and social ostracization associated with prostitution have further marginalized sex workers, obviously predominantly women, reinforce the notion that their bodies and sexuality are commodities to be bought and sold. This dehumanization has had profound psychological and emotional consequences, as sex workers are often denied basic rights and subjected to violence, discrimination, and social exclusion. Marginalized individuals are disproportionately represented in the sex industry, highlighting the nature of this issue and the need for a comprehensive approach to addressing the motivations that drive individuals, particularly women, into this line of work. We'll see if the sex workers are marginalized. So, there are similarities between ancient practices of prostitution involving group sex, threesomes, polyamorous and polygamous relationships, and modern non monogamous relationships and practices post the sexual revolution, particularly among individuals who are not involved in sex work. We'll examine the gendered thesis throughout. In conclusion, examining these relationships, we can better understand how they reflect human sexuality's evolution and the ongoing quest for connection and fulfillment.
So, what are the origins of work, Mr. Meg?
The concept of work dates back to the dawn of humanity. In prehistoric times, early humans engaged in activities necessary for survival, such as hunting, gathering, and tool making. These activities laid the groundwork for more defined roles within communities. As societies evolved, so did the nature of work, eventually leading to the emergence of specialized professions. To understand the concept of the oldest profession, it's essential to consider the earliest human societies. In prehistoric times, survival was the primary concern, and the first professions were likely to be those directly to meeting basic needs. Hunting and gathering were the earliest forms of labor, with individuals specializing in tasks such as tracking animals, foraging for edible plants, and creating tools. These roles were not professions in the modern sense, but rather communal activities essential for survival. As societies evolved, so did the division of labor, and individuals began to have the foundation for more structured professions as civilization developed. The earliest human societies were nomadic, relying on hunting and gathering for sustenance. Men typically hunted, while women gathered fruits, nuts, and other edible plants. This division of labor was essential for survival and set the stage for the development of more complex social structures. And there were the emergence of specialized professions, especially with the advent of agriculture around 10,000 BC. Humans settled into permanent communities, new professions began to emerge. As people no longer needed to focus solely on survival, they could explore other avenues of work and creativity. And this is where we begin to see specialized professions. So, prostitution is the so called oldest profession, and it's the association that stems from its long history and prevalence in ancient societies. References to prostitution can be found in some of the earliest recorded texts, including the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Code of Hammurabi. In ancient Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, prostitution was often regulated and integrated into the social and economic fabric of society. Temples in Mesopotamia, for example, employed sacred prostitutes as part of religious rituals, while in ancient Rome, prostitution was a legal and taxed profession. The oldest profession phrase itself gained popularity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, often used in literature and popular culture to underscore the enduring nature of the trade. However, labeling prostitution as the oldest profession oversimplifies the complexity of early human labor and ignores the other roles that were equally, if not more essential to the development of human societies. While prostitution has a long history, it's important to recognize that other professions had ancient roots. So we have agriculture, healing, medicine, religion, all those other professions as well. But the designation of prostitution as the oldest profession carries cultural and ethical implications. On one hand, it highlights the enduring nature of the trade and its ability to adapt to changing social and economic conditions. On the other hand, it can perpetuate stereotypes and stigmatize those involved in the profession. Moreover, the question of the oldest profession invites reflection on the nature of work itself. What defines a profession? Is it the exchange of goods and services, the specialization of skills, or the social recognition of a role? In conclusion, these questions underscore the complexity of human labor and the ways in which it has evolved over time.
Definitely, definitely they evolve. What can you relate about the work of ancient prostitution and group sex?
In ancient societies, prostitution was not merely a transactional exchange, but often intertwined with religious and social customs. Temples dedicated to various deities frequently employed sacred prostitutes who engaged in sexual acts as part of worship. These practices included group sex, where multiple individuals participated in sexual activities, often viewed as a way to honor the gods and ensure fertility and prosperity for the community. To understand the concept of the oldest profession, it's essential to consider the earliest human societies as civilization grew. In prehistoric times, survival was a primary concern, and the first professions were those that directly met basic needs. Now, however, as societies evolved, division of labor was more specialized, including prostitution. Based on archaeological evidence and written records, it's widely believed that prostitution has been around for thousands of years. In some African cultures, prostitution was associated with spiritual or ritual practices, and it's known that some prostitutes engaged in group sex and other forms of non monogamous sexual activity as a part of these practices. In Asia, prostitution has a long history dating back to ancient China, where it's mentioned in the Book of History around 600 BCE. Prostitution was also legal and regulated, and it's known that prostitutes engaged in group sex and other forms of non monogamous sexual activity. However, this was not universally accepted. There were also strict social norms and taboos around sexuality. In Japan, prostitution was also legal and regulated during the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, with licensed brothels and courtesans being a popular form of entertainment. As societies progressed, attitudes toward prostitution varied widely, influenced by cultural, religious, and political factors. Yet the profession continued to thrive, changing with the times and remaining a constant aspect of human life. It's worth noting that the concept of prostitution has evolved over time, and what is considered prostitution in ancient times may not be exactly the same as what we consider prostitution today. It's difficult to make generalizations about the types of sexual activities that were common or accepted, but we do have some historical records and research, of course. In the history of prostitution in the ancient world, prostitutes engaged in various forms of group and non monogamous sexual practices. There were the sacred prostitutions in Mesopotamia, and some of the earliest records of prostitution date back to ancient Sumeria around 2400 BCE. Prostitution legal and regulated, and women engage in ritual sexual acts as part of religious ceremonies. And in ancient Greek and Roman societies, for example, which had a thriving sex industry that included brothels, courtesans, and even sacred prostitution associated with temples. In these contexts, group sex and polyamorous arrangements were not uncommon. Wealthy patrons would sometimes visit brothels or seek out high class courtesans who would provide sexual services in group settings. Threesomes and other multi partner encounters were documented in ancient erotic art and literature. Additionally, some prostitutes in the ancient world were known to engage in long term polyamorous relationship with multiple partners. This was particularly true of the heterae, or elite Greek courtesans who might have several wealthy lovers at a time. These women provided companionship and sexual pleasures to multiple men, often engaging in group settings that emphasizes social and intellectual companionship alongside physical intimacy. These women often held significant social status. So the gentrified modern hooker is our version of the ancient elite Greek courtesans. In ancient Greek, prostitution was also legal and widespread, with brothels and prostitutes being a common feature of urban life. Greek philosopher Aristotle even wrote about prostitution in his work Politics, describing it as a necessary evil. In the Roman Empire, prostitution was legal and regulated, and in most societies, polygamy was a common practice, and prostitutes engage in polygamous relationships. And so over time, polyamory and polygamy evolved. And so, whether we have a connection between group sex and individual prostitutes, there's certainly enough evidence to show there are threesomes, polyamorous, and polygamous sex were common or accepted in ancient societies. It's clear that prostitution has a long and complex history, and while it's difficult to point to one's oldest profession, prostitution is generally acknowledged because of its commonness and pervasiveness throughout all kinds of ancient societies. The description that we have of prostitution in the ancient world is in contrast to the Judeo-Christian tradition, which broke through all of this and views group sex as sinful and immoral. In the Judeo Christian tradition, sex was then seen as a private and sacred act between two people, husband and wife, within the context of marriage. The Bible prohibits adultery, fornication, and other forms of sexual immorality and views group sex as a violation of God's laws and a rejection of his plan for human relationships. In the Judeo Christian tradition that broke through the ancient world, it emphasizes the importance of monogamy and the sanctity of marriage, viewing group sex as a threat to the institution of marriage and the family. The Bible teaches that marriage is a long life commitment between two people, and sex is a part of that commitment rather than a way to create bonds or express community. In conclusion, such ancient dynamics resonate with modern interpretations of non monogamous relationships that emphasize sexual excess and an abundance of options and are in contrast with the ancient biblical ideas.
So, Mr. Meg, in the post sexual revolution era, a new paradigm.
The sexual revolution of the 1960s and 1970s did not mark a turning back point in societal attitudes or sex and relationships. The movement reaffirmed ancient norms, advocating for sexual immorality and personal excess. As a result, practices such as prostitution, non monogamy, polyamory, threesomes become more common as in earlier centuries. In the post sexual revolution era, the cultural advocacy associated with non monogamous relationships began to flourish. People began to exploit their desires more openly, leading to a greater decline in stable relationship structures. This period also coincided with the rise of feminist movements, which emphasize individual excessive choices in sex. Today, non monogamous relationships are no longer associated with sex work or prostitution or taboo practices. Many individuals engage in threesomes, polyamorous relationship, and open marriages as a way to fulfill any self centered wish or desire. The rise of online communities and dating platforms has facilitated connections among like minded individuals, allowing for an expansive exploration of immorality. Despite the evolution of societal norms and practices, the core motivations behind ancient and modern monogamous relationships remain strikingly similar. The desire for excess and lack of restrictions, highlighting a fundamental aspect of human experience. Both ancient and modern practices emphasize the importance of personal emotional selfishness. In communal ancient societies, those sexual practices fostered a sense of unity and shared experience. Today, polyamorous and non monogamous relationships do not support families and a stronger society, but often complicate emotional connections. Consent is the only element that connects ancient practices with modern misunderstandings of intimacy. With consent, anything goes. While ancient societies may have framed consent in the same way we do today, the communal nature of their sexual practices suggests an inherent understanding of mutual agreement and participation. Modern non monogamous relationships place a strong emphasis on consent, which is the only guideline, and any extravagance can be fulfilled. So, what we have are the same conditions and the same practices as in ancient society, and we are now, as an ordinary person and ordinary people, experiencing all the things that were obvious in ancient society. So, in conclusion, these modern relationships often emphasize a shared responsibility and reflect a more open practice compared to traditional views from the ancient Greco Roman and Judeo Christian contrasts.
So how has society's view evolved about the nature of work?
As history unfolded, societal attitudes towards various professions, including prostitution, shifted dramatically. The Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism brought about new ways of thinking about labor and value. In the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries, transformed economies and societies. Work moved from home based settings to factories, creating a demand for labor. Many women facing limited options turned to prostitution as a means of survival in rapidly urbanizing environments. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the feminist movement began to challenge traditional views of women's roles in society. This shift led to a greater advocacy for women's rights, including discussions around sexuality and work. Prostitution became a focal point for debates about women's autonomy, economic freedom, and social justice. Today, the concept of work encompasses a vast range of professions, including and reflecting ongoing changes in technology, culture, and society. The digital age has introduced new forms of labor, such as remote work and gig economy jobs, reshaping traditional views of employment. The rise of the gig economy has created opportunities and challenges for workers. Many people now engage in freelance work, driving for rideshare apps, delivering food, and including being an object online, both in terms of prostitution and in terms of showing themselves. In conclusion, this so called flexibility appeals to a broad range of individuals, much broader than in the past, including those who may have turned to sex work in previous generations.
Flexibility is one of the adjectives. The modern world, Mr. Mike.
In contemporary society, the conversation around prostitution continues to evolve. Discussions focus on issues of consent, human trafficking, and the rights of sex workers. So, as defined as the world's oldest profession, prostitution has continued to exist throughout human history. And now we can see how it has changed to the gig economy and in the modern economy as we understand it today. In conclusion, prostitution can be traced back to ancient civilizations where it was intertwined with religious and cultural practices, and now has become part of the ordinary person who also can engage in prostitution.
So this is a big question, Mr. Mick. Why do married men see sex workers?
Sure, if you talk to modern sex workers, you can see and understand why they might be engaged in this practice along with prostitutions. Most common reason is that husbands don't get sex at home and they want their lust satisfied. Oddly enough, they're often in a stable, loving relationship with a wife they deeply care for. They may have kids in a nice home, which they don't want to throw away by getting a divorce or cheating in the real world. However, I still read their situation as a lack of intimacy. Temporary, superficial sex is not emotional intimacy. Some of the best relationship advice for a marriage is to continue your dating and emotional intimacy with your spouse, regardless of pressures from a job, finances, or arguably even your children. Kids are often easier than a spouse to be with since they are your creation and remind you of you and your legacy. An unsatisfied partner will seek sex elsewhere. Men are not so obsessed with penetrating a vagina as many women think, according to Substack article, which was a working prostitute, our secret escort confidant called The Secret Escort. They sound more childlike and pathetic, whining that something like their wife no longer kisses them, hugs them, or holds their hand. They want physical connection rather than only an orgasm. There are those men who have an active sex life with their spouse, but maybe have a certain kink or fantasy they wish to play out with which their wife has no desire for. As a result, they resort to the service of a sex worker. Some men enjoy the thrill of cheating, but without the challenge of seeking an actual woman for an affair with a colleague or a woman they meet in a bar. The discretionary escort is not going to do the pop in, showing up at their doorstep unannounced or phoning their wife. There is no fear of exposure since both parties simply want a business transaction, and afterwards, there's no obligation for subsequent contact. The escort, who is our representative and informative here, simply provides a service to any client who betrays his wife, children, and family. The secret escort is really jaded because she advises that not only married men cheat, not all of them, but no longer does she enjoy the innocent fairy tale view on relationships she once held. The single, lonely guys can become clingy and convince themselves that they are in a real relationship opposed to a paid fantasy, but this never happens with married men. Men in cheating marriages know the limits and the interaction, and they know how to treat the whore with respect, renting nice hotel rooms rather than dirty bachelor pads, and then usually very conscious of doing everything correctly. Still, the prostitute is not always to blame. They are not calling the men. Men know what they are doing and they seek out the prostitute. The prostitutes are not tempting men, but generally speaking, men are always being tempted by women. Our informant, the secret escort, prefers that partners spend time with a professional sex worker with no emotional commitment rather than having a love affair with another young, desirable woman. The secret escort considers monogamy is a ridiculous rule imposed by religion. In conclusion, like the ancient courtesans, she encourages the ideas of polyamory, open relationships, experimenting with swinging, or threesomes.
So, Mr. Mick, what is the gentrification of sex work?
Another Substack article by Oyster, not making up the name, describes gentrification was a transformation that occurs when affluent, middle class, or upper class individuals inhabit a previously low income, working class, or marginalized occupation. In this case, prostitution. It appears sex work has become somewhat upscale, and not only the poor and marginalized women of the past, our informant, Oyster, relates that her prostitution after 10 years results in a clean break between my real self and my working persona. She is a sex work writer with a separation between her personal self and her as the lady of the evening. She believes that's a difficult line between her writing, hooking, and her advocacy of the idea of sex for money. Outsiders have more taboos or find the crossing of the line between writing and hooking as salacious and perhaps even morally questionable act. Her chapbook is along the lines of capitalism and sex work framed through cardinal sin. The enticing nature of prostitution blurred the subtext of her work, which she believes is inherently political. For some time, she thought of herself as a good hooker because of a firm maintenance between the boundaries of prostitution and writing, a clean compartmentalization. Deconstructing her identity to sex work, specifically high end sex work, involved a lot of thought about the classification of how she was to look high class and desirable. Her accessories feed the fantasy for the client who could flaunt that he could afford the girl and her extravagant taste. The gentrification of sex work is a gentrification of the self, a statement of politics. Oyster sees her sex work and a political cause, rebelling against patriarchy and traditional systems, people on the fringes outside conventional society. In her important way, in her view, her work is heroic and noble. She notes how it's probably the easiest time to get into the prostitution industry, but the hardest to make any money from it. She notes that the club is dead, porn is free, and everything is expensive. For many years, if you wanted to do sex work, you either had to go to a dungeon, a club, put up an ad, break into the porn industry, or build a fan base of patrons through a melange of clip sites. With the advent of social media, the death of the newspaper, and the ever present metaphysical reality we've created online, a brand new erotic on demand service appears. And we've talked about this on this podcast before OnlyFans. The site ushered in one of the largest introduction of new sex workers in 2020, a credit to the pandemic, which has streamlined even further the process of becoming a sex worker. All you need is a valid ID and internet service. The normalization of prostitution is now available to the petite bourgeoisie who arrived in the industry with a class interest that opposes the basic ordinary worker of the past from the lower classes. Sex work is now gentrified or actively engaged in by upwardly mobile women and not the usual gender underclass. Prostitution is a capitalist, professional, and a managerial bourgeoisie activity. Oyster is upper class and not lower class as an engaged business prostitute. In conclusion, the gentrified prostitute unifies sisterhood, stalwart women, whether turning a $20 trick or a $2,000 one.
So, Mr. Mick, to wrap up our discussion for today, how can we conclude this discussion?
In summary, how come with so much sexual activity going on, we have fewer children than ever before? Prostitution is often labeled as the world's oldest profession. It embodies a rich tapestry of historical narratives, cultural significance, and gender related issues. This complexity makes it a critical subject for understanding social structures and the evolution of women's roles across time and culture. With abundance of relationship options of all types, fewer children are being born, and subsequently, you weaker families. And I would think if we could measure happiness objectively, we would find we moderns are just as frustrated and unhappy as the ancient were, but we look for sexual fulfillment. The question of what constitutes the world's oldest profession invites a reflection and also an understanding of where we are in history. It is a timeless quest for connection. Prostitution had group sex in the ancient world, threesomes, polyamory, polygamy, and modern non monogamous relationships. And we are beginning to repeat everything that happened in the ancient world. However, there's now the upper class, or at least middle class, woman who engages in the same activities as in the ancient world. In the Judeo Christian perspective, prostitution is viewed as a morally reprehensible and sinful activity. The Bible condemns prostitution in several passages, including Leviticus 19:29, which states, "Do not profane your daughter by making her a prostitute, lest the land fall into prostitution and the land become defiled." Similarly, Deuteronomy 23:17 through 18 prohibits prostitution, stating, "None of the daughters of Israel shall be a prostitute, nor shall any of the sons of Israel be a male prostitute. You shall not bring the fee of a prostitute or the wages of a male prostitute into the house of the Lord your God in payment of any vow, for both of these are abhorrent to the Lord your God." The biblical prohibition on prostitution is based on the idea that it is a form of idolatry where people are worshiping their own desires and lusts rather than God. The Judeo Christian perspective on prostitution is also influenced by the concept of the body as a temple. In 1 Corinthians 6:19 through 20, the Apostle Paul writes, "Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, which you have from God? You are not your own, you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body." This passage emphasizes the importance of treating one's body with respect and dignity, and prostitution is seen as a violation of this principle. Additionally, so to conclude, the Judeo Christian perspective on prostitution, which broke through the view of prostitution in the ancient world, has the idea of human dignity and the value of every human life. Prostitution is seen as a dehumanizing and degrading activity that reduces people to mere objects for sexual gratification rather than treating them as a valuable and worthy individuals created in the image of God.
Indeed, prostitution is a complex and controversial issue that intersects with the social, economic, and legal factors. It has existed throughout history in the various forms, from regulated industries to underground markets. while some argue that sex work should be decriminalized or recognized as a legitimate profession to ensure workers' rights and safety. Mr. Mick, another great episode on Sex One on One. Would you like to plug something?
Sure, if you don't mind. So I'm the Idea to Author Coach on Facebook. I help writers write books and help writers sell more books. You can also catch me on Mick, the Doctor of Digital podcast. Also, a couple books out there, On Track, Ian Hunter, and Burning America. Both volumes available on Amazon.
Yes, people, support Mr. Mick because if you support him, more books to come. And of course, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, Food 101, in its fifth season with Chef Alessandro One of a specialty chef in one of the five-star hotel in downtown Toronto. Please do listen to our latest episode. We are reading the letters of our listeners. So please do listen, Food 101. So, Mr. Mick, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel. JSO.
More to come, people. See you soon. I think
Great.
we're logging, right, Mr. Mick? Some of the
Lagging,
episodes are logging. Yes. Are you logging or me? I'm the one who's logging.
it's you from what I could hear. You could still hear it,
Yeah.
but there was kind of like a little half second delay, and then your voice came in.
Yes.
So
Yes.